Alright, hopefully this recording thing is working. So, good afternoon or good evening or whenever you're viewing this, my World Civilizations 1 classes. So, I hope you all are enjoying and taking advantage of the extra little bit of time you're going to be getting off. Get caught up in this class, get caught up in other classes, relax. Whatever you're able to do, please do so. Now, like I said in the emails you hopefully got, which again, I do apologize for sending those twice, but I like to just double check myself. I'm going to be recording myself going through the material we were supposed to cover today. Hopefully my recording is still working. It's freezing on me a bit. Please be patient with my technology. Hopefully it'll catch up to me eventually. But anyway, this is going to be pretty simple and straightforward. I'll go through it obviously much quicker than we would in class. I mainly just want to make sure you're focusing on the main portions of the content that I want you to in order to do the best you can on the assignments that can come from this material. If you have any questions about it, of course, feel free to shoot me an email, come to my office hours, everything like that. After today, the class is going to be running on a normal schedule, so I'll be available at all the normal times I'm supposed to be. However, do also keep in mind, of course, that we will not have class on Wednesday. That was already scheduled, of course, so I won't see you guys until next Monday. But anyway, in the meantime, again, if my PowerPoint will work, what key terms we're going to be looking at today. We're first going to identify something called flying cash. We're going to look at the movable type printing press. We're going to look at manorialism. I can never pronounce that. Then we'll look at the Crusades, which I do wish we got to cover in person today, but, you know, life happens and all that. And we will end in something called the Reconquista, which is one of my favorite words for some reason, but please don't judge me. Now, also, as always, I do like to make sure you're aware of upcoming assignments, things of that nature. Your writing assignment is coming up on November the 16th at 5 p.m. I will also be sending out a reminder email about this, but a classmate of yours, when you guys are watching this, pointed out that my prompt for this assignment, frankly, wasn't really worded that well, and it didn't really fit with what we've ended up covering versus what I thought we were going to cover when I wrote the prompt before the semester started. So if it is not a huge inconvenience to anyone, I went ahead and took the liberty of changing the prompt to, I think, make it fit a little bit better with what we've been covering, focusing mainly on the comparisons and differences between the Christian and Muslim world. So the prompt has changed a little bit, but all of that is still on Blackboard. You'll have a content quiz then coming up on the 18th, and your final essay outline is due by November the 24th. Of course, as always, all these are due on 5 p.m. at their due dates. And again, the details for the final essay outline are located in the final essay folder in Blackboard. Specifically, go look in the prompt like you did for the thesis and for the bibliography assignment. As always, any questions about this stuff, please let me know as soon as you can. In the meantime, a couple of questions I'd like you to consider as we go throughout this lesson and the rest of the semester that we would normally have been discussing today. First, why might it be important for a country to have a strong sense of identity? Like, what exactly does it mean for a country to have an identity, and why is that important? And to give it a point of comparison, think about America's identity. Does America have a strong identity? And if so, what is it? And now, a big one that we're going to be considering for really the rest of the semester, how should a country compare itself to outsiders? Is it a good idea, for example, to refer to outsiders as barbarians, as the Greeks, Romans, and as we'll talk about today, the Chinese often did? Finally, think about nationalism. I recommend you all look up the definition of nationalism and patriotism, compare them, and consider whether or not they're good or bad things. But anyway, to get more specifically into today's stuff, we're going to start off with the Song Dynasty. The Song Dynasty began in 907 CE when the Tang Dynasty, we discussed a couple of weeks ago, collapsed into several different regional kingdoms, as it happened in various times in Chinese history. By 960 CE, this individual, Zhao, I'm not going to try to pronounce that name right there, reunited China and claimed again the mandate of heaven for the Song Dynasty, which would rule most of China from about 960 to 1279 CE. Importantly, this is when the Chinese began to refer to themselves more commonly as Han, and when they began to refer to outsiders, the Koreans, various nomadic tribes, as barbarians. So as you can see, China's starting to get a bit more of a distinct identity. We'll talk about exactly how that happened as we continue. Now, one thing that set the Song Dynasty apart from previous Chinese experiences was their agriculture and manufacturing. Their fields were so cultivatable They were actually capable of feeding a population of about 120 million, for the most part without any major famine or starvation. Part of this is because they were able, for the first time, to combine their iron plows with water buffalo, allowing them to extend their cultivatable land. So they could use essentially finally hooking a plow up to an animal to increase the amount of land they could farm upon. Many historians also refer to the Song dynasty as the first manufacturing revolution. For example, by the early 10th century, alchemists had begun to mix salt, pepper, sulfur, and charcoal to make gunpowder. So, as you may already know, the Chinese were the first to invent gunpowder. They produced light and durable porcelains for an international market, so they sold, as you might imagine, all across the Silk Road and the Silk Road by the sea, which is actually where the term China for dishes comes from. It literally is named after the country of China. They would use fiber supplies from the Song farmers who, again, could make this enormous production output to make vast amounts of clothes for their people. Also, perhaps most impressively, their iron production was so vast that it's estimated that their iron output on an annual basis could equal the output of 18th century Europe by just the 11th century. Now, one thing we would have discussed in class if we had met is this. Why do you think we don't talk about China's manufacturing capabilities very often? What do you think it might overshadow? I hope you guys won't mind me taking a sip of water during this. But yes, as some of you might imagine, typically it's argued by historians that we don't focus on this period because it's something that could take away from the significance of our typical focus on the European Industrial Revolution. Despite how important that event in history was, much of that was already being accomplished by the Chinese many, many years before. But in our American history classes, since we still call ourselves the descendants of Europeans, we don't really like to focus on that as much. Anyway, to get a little bit more into the Song, their economy and politics were also quite innovative. For example, from about 1100 CE on, the Song government was capable of minting 2 million strings of currency. To give you a bit idea of what that means, each of these single strings would contain 1,000 copper coins. So I frankly didn't feel like doing the math for that, but that's quite a bit of coins being produced per year, obviously, all across Song China. Now, this did lead to a couple of problems. Occasionally, the demand for currency metal did outpace the supply, so they literally didn't have enough metal to make all these coins. In response to this, a northwestern ethnic group called the Changxi, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, which I'm probably not, developed the first paper money in response, which is something the Chinese called flying cash. Over time, flying cash began to actually outnumber the amount of metal coins available. Now, for any of my economy friends, what can this potentially lead to? Now you guys know, by the way, what it's like when I teach my completely online classes. I just stare at the camera waiting for them to answer the question at home. It's about as fun as it sounds. But yes, any of you who are economists probably know this is where you get the idea of inflation. If you're overprinting your money and it doesn't match the actual money supply or your gold standard, whatever standard you use, leads to inflation. Prices are just going to go up. You're not going to be able to buy anything. China did, despite the fact that this is an innovative process, it did start to lead to inflation for perhaps the first time in world history. The civil service examinations were still used by the Song, but they became more competitive. It actually got to the point under the Song dynasty that Zhao Huangyan, I think I actually pronounced it right that time, who would later be known as Emperor Taizu after he started his dynasty, would administer the final tests for the top prospects himself. As you might imagine, this would of course inspire more effort and more competitiveness, hopefully, ideally leading to even more qualified employees and government officials serving the Song dynasty. So again, he began to take a very active role in ensuring that he had top-notch employees for his government. Now, like I said, I hinted at the beginning of this lesson, one of the main things I want to focus on right now is the relationship between China and the outside world. China had to deal with quite a bit of nomadic tribes at the time. They began to unite on the borders of China and would copy their technology like their steel-tipped arrows, their flamethrowers, or crouching tiger catapults, which is the greatest name for a weapon I've ever heard. I do challenge you to find me one better, and also their crossbows. The Song dynasty would typically respond to all these groups not by fighting them directly, but paying them off with flying cash, which led to a further increase in money printing. Now again, why might this be a big problem? Again, yeah, remember what we just talked about. Inflation. Inflation was already an issue before they started paying off these groups, but as they were required to print even more money to pay off these various nomadic groups, inflation got even worse. We'll talk about some of the problems with that later in the semester. But in the meantime, in relationship to Japan, Japan, as some of you may know, typically throughout history has had a very isolationist attitude, not unlike America. However, despite this, they were still influenced by the success of China and eventually modeled their capital city of Heian, later known as Kyoto, after the Chinese capital of Chang'an. I'm 100% sure I pronounced that right. Any of you who know, if any of you know Chinese better than me, I apologize deeply. However, despite this, because again, Japan was a bit isolated and didn't want to copy China entirely, the samurai class began to pop up for the first time around a little after 1000 CE and began to gain power outside of the capital. At the same time, wealthy merchants were also trying to gain power and struggle for power outside of the capital. Now, to give you a bit of an idea, is this a good political situation? Yeah, I'll give you a short pause for that one. You could probably guess it really is probably not going to be. So on the one hand, you have an imperial city trying to model itself after imperial China, but you have various groups outside of the center of power all struggling for control. As we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester and a bit more if you guys are ever in World Civilizations 2, this is essentially one of the main reasons Japan never really united until much later in their history than some other countries we discussed. They essentially had an imperial city with only real limited power, and these various other groups trying to get power as well. Outside of China, the Malay Peninsula was also influenced by China's success. Various trading kingdoms in this region started to pop up and locate themselves between India and China. Now, based on what we've already discussed and what we talked about with India, why would this be a good place to set up your kingdom? Think about what was going on in that map of India I showed you last time. I believe on Wednesday. Very good. Again, viewers hopefully watching this at home, it's all about the money, as you might imagine. Setting up your kingdom in between these massive trade routes between India and China is a great way to siphon off some of that profit. For example, we already talked a few weeks ago about the Khmer Kingdom, which lasted from about 889 to 1431 CE, that combined the practices of Hinduism and Buddhism in their empire and essentially served as middlemen of the trade between China and India. Now, to get a little more specific about the formation of a more specific Chinese identity. According to historians, one of the main causes of this identity was the invention of the movable type printing press in 1040 by Bi Sheng. This is considered again to be one of the main factors in establishing a distinct Chinese identity. One of the couple main reasons for this. One, the Song dynasty printed enough books that it essentially established Chinese as the dominant language of elites in East Asia. Now, how do you think this is going to strengthen Chinese identity? Very good. Once again, imaginary class. Of course, people are going to feel united again over a larger region if they're all speaking the same language and can more easily communicate. Makes it much easier to share religions, share cultures, share economic practices, all of that fun stuff. Very similar to how we talked about, for example, with the Vedic civilization. They weren't united, but they still shared a common identity, largely because they all spoke roughly the same language. The same thing essentially happened in China, and also was a big part of increasing China's influence across the region, because you notice I said East Asia, I didn't just say China. Other individuals who want to share the wealth of China picked this language up as well. Some of their publications also included Confucian classics, history, philosophy, fiction, and various Buddhist texts. This would again also increase the Chinese identity because you have people essentially consuming the same type of literature, reading the same types of histories, instead of just sort of having things passed down orally or reading the occasional text. Uniform publication is very important in establishing an identity because it allows everyone over a much larger space of area able to consume the same type of information. Which, of course, as you might imagine, will be relevant when we get to things like the Protestant Reformation. But in the meantime, we are going to go ahead and get into the Crusades and other Christian Europe issues we haven't quite discussed yet. Now, what I'd like you to do first is to go ahead and pause this video and view this video right here, which is again another clip from the fantastic Monty Python and the Holy Grail movie. What I want you to do here is look at some of the conclusions we can reach about what the average European's life was like during the Middle Ages. Again, this is a very exaggerated comedic scene, obviously, but look at some of the struggles the characters are going through. What would life have been like for these people? But anyway, in the meantime, we'll talk a little bit today about the start of a European identity. From about 1000 to 1300 CE, most political power in Europe was very localized, kind of like we mentioned, although a couple of weeks ago. Especially after the end of Charlemagne's empire, there wasn't much of a centralized kingdom in Western Europe. Most of Europe was organized around a system more recent historians like to call manorialism, I hate that word, I'm sorry, which is also very similar to what historians used to call feudalism. Essentially, you would have an economic system where local lords, basically that elite knightly class we talked about who protected the monks, would own land that was farmed by peasants and more occasionally used for manufacturing. Because again, unlike China, since they weren't very united, they didn't have much of a manufacturing base. So again, this is not a very united system, because your average peasant, as you saw in this video right here, is not going to have much of an idea of the outside world, and their real only allegiance is going to be to their local lord. Now, this again raises the question of the European identity. Are these people actually European? Because again, they don't really have any loyalty to the monarchs we know of, France, England, Spain, all that fun stuff. So if they are European, what actually still makes them European? Keep that in mind again as we continue. But in the meantime, we look a little bit about how manorialism spread across Europe. From about 11,000 to 1200 CE, you had about 200,000 peasants who went across Western Europe and eventually settled in the frontier portion of Europe, Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, the Baltic states, and things of that nature. Again, are these individuals European, and why do we typically consider this part of Europe to be the frontier? We typically focus on these Western European nations as sort of being the main center of Europe, and I would imagine many of you probably couldn't name any of these Baltic states, for example. We don't really pay attention to those. Why is that the case, and are they still European? Keep that in mind. Now, Russia, at this point in time, was starting to become more of a cultural icon, and was located between the Central Asian kingdoms and Western Europe, which again, like India, is going to make them quite a bit of wealth because they're in between some of these trading routes. Trading centers started to spread up across Russia before they really became united. You'd have these cities as outposts for migration and trade in basically isolated areas surrounded by huge forests and very widely scattered settlements. For example, you had the city Kiev here, which was modeled directly after Constantinople and contained a miniature version of the Hagia Sophia, which was the great church of Constantinople. Now, another thing that set Russia apart from other countries you discussed is that they followed the Byzantium Greek Orthodoxy instead of Roman Catholicism. So again, give a point of comparison. Is Russia still a part of Europe? We talked a little bit over the past couple of weeks about how European identity was mainly coming from Catholicism. So if Russia isn't getting on board with the whole Catholicism thing, are they still European? That's another little thing I'd like you to chew on for a bit. In the meantime, one of the main things we're going to look at for how a Russian or European identity was finally formed is looking at the relationship between Muslims and a European identity. According to many historians, European identity was actually formed in opposition to the Muslim world. Now again, we talked about this a little bit before. Why would having some constant threat like the Muslim Empire be so useful in creating your own identity? Awkward pause again. But yeah, for those of you who remember, for example, when we discussed the Roman Empire and their barbarians they constantly fought against, typically, if you look throughout history, when you have a constant threat you can sort of unite your people against, it makes them much more loyal and much more willing to work together because they believe that their every effort is an attempt to stop some sort of horrible enemy. So essentially, Europe was able to become more identified and become more united, to a certain extent at least, because they can consider to themselves, at least we're not Muslim, and we have to work together to fight against the Muslim world. So therefore, despite the limited practical success of the Crusades we're getting ready to discuss, Many historians do credit the Crusades with helping to give a more solid and distinct European identity. Now, to get into the nitty-gritty of the Crusades. The Crusades are credited with being started by Pope Urban II in 1095. He urged the warrior class of Europe to go reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule instead of fighting amongst each other. One of the ways he was able to get on board was that he claimed that this violence would be an absolution from sin, not a source from sin. So instead of typically how we consider violence being some sort of a result of sin and causing evil, the Pope claimed that if you participated in these crusades, it would essentially absolve you from all your sins. Boom, you get a direct ticket upstairs. Now, is this an ethical thing to do? Complicated question, isn't it? Yeah, I totally recognize that. But again, whatever you feel about it can show the power that religion still did have upon uniting people and motivating them to support the state. So essentially, because they still were such great believers in religion, they were willing to go fight these crusades in order to satisfy their religious leaders. The First Crusade formally got underway by 1097, where about 60,000 soldiers left northwestern Europe to try to seize Jerusalem from the Islamic empires. They had various forms of troops. Heavily armored knights would go along with a lot of impoverished peasants, who again wanted that salvation or some riches. They were also supported by fleets from Venice, Genoa, and Pisa in Italy. One other interesting crusade I'd like to point out that many people aren't aware of is the alleged Children's Crusade of 1212. Allegedly, and historians debate how accurate this is to this day, as you might imagine, it is believed that 12-year-old Stephen of Blois led a following of children all the way to Paris from across Europe to seek the King of France's permission to start a crusade. For instance, this is actually considered to be possible inspiration for the Pied Piper legend, since if this is true, you have a charismatic leader leading children all across Europe. However, they were denied approval. So one reason we don't always remember the Children's Crusade is that if it even did happen, it was not an officially sanctioned crusade. They were unarmed and believed that they could convert the Muslims just through divine intervention and not through any show of force, which might help you guess how this is probably going to end. The crusade was eventually believed to have fallen apart, as far as historians can tell, after they reached Italy and were denied the sanction and approval of the Pope. So it's believed some just went on home, some stayed in the area and got various jobs, and it's believed some were also sold into slavery. So essentially, if this did happen, it did not have a very productive end. Now, interestingly enough, unlike the other crusaders going around during this time, these children were labeled as fanatics by the Roman Catholic Church. Why do you think that might be the case? As you might guess, it comes again from their religious desire to keep their power and to not seem like they were losing control of their constituents, followers, or whatever you would like to call it. As I mentioned here, they were denied approval by the King of France, but they kept going. It is also believed that they kept trying to go after they were denied the sanction of the Pope. So on the one hand, you have the Pope directly urging crusades and giving his blessing. That's typically not going to be the same response you get when a crusade tries to go on without political or religious approval. So again, a lot of times these religious leaders form alliances with political leaders to keep their control and authority over people. Yeah, especially during the Middle Ages, of course. Now, a couple of actions of the Crusaders to help get across how brutal they could sometimes be. In 1096, it's believed that a man named Count Amico led a massacre of Jews across the Rhineland. In 1099, in conclusion of the First Crusade, the Crusaders were actually to reach and sack Jerusalem and had killed hundreds of men, women, and children as they entered the city. By 1204, as we mentioned a little bit earlier in this class, Frankish Crusaders did directly attack Constantinople and looted and burned much of the city, including one of their great churches and the Imperial Library. So again, very horrific actions were conducted during the Crusades, which is part of why they have such a brutal history, why they're so brutally remembered in much of our history. Now, to go ahead and start wrapping things up a little bit, we will look at the failure of the Crusades very generally. I do hate that I couldn't talk more about the Crusades, but please be thankful There were 9 of them, so we'd be here all day if I try to talk about every single crusade. But again, just like I said, there were 9 crusades fought in total about over the 2 centuries after Pope Urban's sermon. This is, of course, if you count the Children's Crusade. If you don't, there were 8 officially sanctioned ones. Couple of reasons for the lack of a long-lasting impact. Many knights, since again this was a very religious cause and it was again mostly sought for religious absolution or forgiveness of your sins, many knights and participants only really saw this as a pilgrimage. They didn't really want to go all the way out into this world they didn't understand and settle there. They viewed it as a pilgrimage where they would go and fight in the name of God and the name of the church. And when that was done, they would go back home thinking their pilgrimage was now done. So it was very difficult to set up any sort of lasting kingdom or lasting power in Muslim territory. This is made even worse by the fact that the Crusades never really got close to the great Islamic centers of power. The network of castles that they did set up was far away from Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. So essentially, even when they were able to conquer something, even if it was somewhat permanent, or at least a little bit longer than you might think, they never were able to attack the actual centers of Muslim power, so they weren't really able to upset any actual balance of power. Also, as we'll talk a little bit more as we get into the later portion of the class, there was a lack of prolonged unity in the Christian world. So while at times the Pope could inspire Christians to unite and go fight in the Crusades against the Islamic world, this unity typically did not last very long, and the European monarchs would get into other wars amongst themselves, as we'll talk about in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, to get a little bit more into the formation of the Christian identity and talk about a more successful example, we'll look at the Reconquista, when more of Europe was considered to finally be Christian. Reconquista is a Spanish word for reconquest, which is a series of campaigns led by the Spanish Christian kings to try to expel Muslim kingdoms from the Iberian Peninsula. Now, one thing I actually never picked up on until grad school, which I think is actually pretty interesting, is the idea that this shouldn't really be called the Reconquista or the Reconquest. Because if you think about it, Reconquest implies that the Christian kingdoms controlled all of Spain at one point, and they're trying to take it back after it was lost to the Muslims. However, I know we didn't have very much time to talk about it, but if you remember a couple of weeks ago, when we were first talking about the spread of the Islamic world, Islam actually had gotten to Spain many centuries previously to this, and had actually been there longer than Christianity in many places. So this actually isn't a Reconquista, it's just a conquest. Why do you think they would call it the Reconquista or the Reconquest then? What's the point of that? Very good. Again, audience hopefully watching at home, it's essentially propaganda. If you claim that this is a reconquest and you're taking back land you lost, it essentially justifies your actions. Sounds much nicer to say, hey, I'm reclaiming land I lost, instead of saying, I'm going to go claim this land from you that I've never actually had any claim to. Very similarly to the Crusades, for example. Much easier to get people on board if you say, hey, we're going to protect our Holy Land and take it back, instead of just saying, hey, go over and fight and kill these people. It's all about how you market these kind of things, essentially. Now, this, as I said, the Reconquista was much more successful overall than the Crusades. By 1061, the Spanish kings had captured Toledo and most of northern Spain, and by 1246, they conquered Seville and most of southern Spain. So essentially, the vast majority of the Iberian Peninsula was now united. The conquest added roughly 100,000 square miles of territory for Christian Europe, and to make matters worse for Muslims in Western Europe, by 1265, the French had conquered the Muslim-held Sicily, again at the urging of the Pope. So essentially, you now have more of Western Europe united and officially controlled by Christian monarchs, and therefore, by extension, the religious leaders of Europe as well. So essentially, Europe is now finally getting more united and set up in opposition to the Muslim world. So again, based on what we've learned today, and we'll talk about this a bit more next week, how exactly should a nation form its identity, and what kind of identity should it have? Should you try to form your identity in opposition to people who live outside of your country or nationality, like the Chinese and Europeans did? Or should you maybe try to do something different? But again, I'll leave that up to you. Like I said, we'll discuss it a bit more towards the end of the semester. But in the meantime, just remember these upcoming assignments and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.